What if the arrival of Islam in South Asia wasn't marked by conquest, but by coexistence? In today's deep dive, we journey through the Chachnama's political theory of difference, a world where rulers negotiated power not through forced conversion, but through alliance, law, and respect for pluralism. So when we typically think about the arrival of Islam in South Asia, especially the early campaigns like the Umayyads in Sind, 8th century, there's this really dominant story.
The conquest narrative.
Exactly. It's often framed as just this straightforward foreign invasion, a clear line drawn between Muslim and Hindu right from the get-go.
Yeah, and that narrative gets used to explain a lot, historically speaking. Later tensions, even partition, sometimes gets traced back to that idea of an initial unavoidable conflict.
But it's a pretty contentious view, right? It emphasizes the military side, maybe overlooking other kinds of interaction.
It certainly does. And it tends to paint the picture as inherently one of conflict, maybe simplifying things quite a bit.
Which brings us to the source material for today. Mananda Ahmed Asif's work on the Chachnama seems to, well, challenge that standard account pretty directly.
It really does. Asif looks at this 13th century text, the Chachnama, and argues it's not quite what people have often assumed.
Like, for one thing, he suggests it might have been originally Persian, not just a translation of an earlier Arabic text.
That's part of his argument, yeah. But the bigger point, for our discussion anyway, is his claim about what the text is actually doing.
He says it's not just a history of conquest.
Not primarily, no. He reads it as something much more sophisticated, a work of political theory, actually.
Political theory, drawing on both Indic and Islamic ideas.
Exactly. Embedded in both traditions. It's grappling with these fundamental questions. How do you rule? How do you create a stable society when you have different religious groups, different power structures, all in one place?
So the Chachnama isn't just telling a story, it's proposing a model, maybe.
That's the idea. So our mission today, using the analysis you've provided, is to sort of unpack the Chachnama through Asif's lens. We want to get at its core political vision.
Specifically how it deals with religious difference, coexistence, political organization in medieval Sind.
Right. And how that offers a kind of corrective to these modern narratives that just assume division from the start.
Okay, let's dive into that. This idea of the Chachna as political theory, what is Asif saying is its main thrust?
Well, his central thesis is that the Chachnama is fundamentally addressing the reality of what he terms sacral difference.
Sacral difference, meaning the presence of multiple religions with their own sacred claims.
Precisely. Among the elites, among the general population, in 13th century Sind. The text isn't trying to wish this difference away. It's trying to figure out how to build a political system around it.
So it argues for recognizing diversity, for accommodation, alliance even.
Yes. Recognition, accommodation, alliance, these are key themes. And this really pushes back against those arguments that tie mass conversion directly to conquest, which has shaped a lot of thinking about this period.
And you mentioned the context Kobosha's Uch in the 13th century, a pretty diverse place.
Extremely. Heterodox, polyglots, lots of beliefs, lots of languages. Asif argues the Chachnama is basically showing us the political thinking, the theory that made that kind of world possible.
Okay, that makes sense. A kind of handbook for governing difference. How does the text illustrate these encounters? Asif highlights this recurring image, the idol with ruby eyes.
Yeah, this motif is fascinating. It pops up in other Muslim writings about India too, often marking these sort of frontier zones, encounters with the unfamiliar.
And in the Chachnama, its first big appearance is actually before Islam arrives, with the Brahmin ruler Chach.
That's right. Chach is besieging Brahmabad, a Buddhist city. The head priest there helps the defenders hold out for a year, using what Chach perceives as magic or cunning. Chach is, understandably, pretty angry.
Vows revenge, right?
Initially, yes. But then, after the city falls, he goes into the temple alone to confront the priest. And he sees something unexpected.
What does he see?
Next to the priest, invisible to anyone else, he sees this figure. The text calls it a demon, ugly and fearful. And crucially, its eyes are like embers glowing or rubies.
Whoa, ruby eyes. And that changes things.
Completely. Chach is terrified. Instead of revenge, he makes peace. He even agrees to rebuild the Buddhist temple at the priest's request.
So what's going on there, according to Asif?
Asif sees this as the text exploring how different forms of power, Chach's political military power and the priest's sacral power, symbolized by this ruby-eyed figure, can coexist, is not resolved by force.
It's resolved through understanding, recognition.
Sort of mutual recognition, yeah. Chach recognizes the priest's power, both spiritual and implicitly, political in its ability to influence events. It leads to compromise. The ruby eyes mark this moment of negotiation, of translation between these different regimes of power.
Translation, that's an interesting word for it. So the ruby eyes signify this process of bridging divides.
And Asif shows how the Chachnama picks up this symbol and uses it differently than some earlier texts.
Right, you mentioned a genealogy. How did others use it?
Well, Baladhuri in the 9th century tells of an idol with ruby eyes in Dawar. The Muslim commander takes the eyes to show the idol is powerless. It's about asserting dominance.
Okay, conquest pure and simple.
Then you get geographers like Istakri and Ibn Hawqal in the 10th century. They talk about the idol in Multan, also with ruby eyes, but their focus is on the wealth and prosperity linked to the temple. And crucially,
It's left alone.
exactly, left unmolested, protected by the local Muslim rulers. Here, the ruby eyes represent political coexistence, a negotiated frontier.
Wow, quite a shift.
Then Biruni, early 11th century, talks about Multan too. He notes an earlier Muslim leader, Qasim, showed some disrespect initially, but ultimately let the temple be, recognizing its material benefits.
Pragmatism.
But Biruni contrasts this with the later Shia group, the Karamita, who destroyed the temple. He uses the whole story to critique the Karamita and praise Mahmud of Ghazni for supposedly restoring proper order, though Ghazni just rebuilt the mosque, leaving the Karamita temple ruins. So the symbol gets tangled in internal Muslim conflicts too.
Fascinating how the meaning evolves. So how does the Chachnama's Qasim interact with these ruby-eyed idols compared to Chach and these earlier accounts?
Well, Qasim has encounters that echo both. At Auror, he enters a temple, sees a figure with a gold and ruby bracelet, takes it. The priest points out the idol had two, asks why God didn't know. Qasim,
He gets angry, destroys it.
no. He smiles and gives the bracelet back. It's a display of dominance, sure, but it ends peacefully. The temple's sacrality is acknowledged.
Okay, and then Multan.
Then Multan. Qasim enters the temple there, sees a gold idol with two bright ruby eyes glowing red,
Just like Chach saw.
exactly like Chach. And just like Chach, Qasim is frightened. He thinks it's a man, reaches for his sword. But the caretaker, the Brahmin priest, intervenes. Explains it's just an idol, tells him about treasure hidden inside.
So the caretaker acts as a translator again.
Precisely. He mediates. And Qasim, like Chach before him, calms down. He doesn't destroy anything. Instead, he protects the temple, makes a pact with the people, establishes a mosque nearby, appoints an administrator. He creates a political order based on accommodation.
The red eyes explicitly linking the pre-Islamic encounter with the Islamic one.
Yes. Asif argues the ruby eyes consistently symbolize this necessary work of mediation and translation, often done by non-Muslims required for governance in this diverse landscape. It's the Chachnama's way of showing a recurring political challenge and its preferred solution: negotiation, not annihilation.
This really does shift the focus away from simple conquest. Which brings us to that really thorny issue, conversion. If the Chachnama isn't just about conquest, what does it say about people changing their religion?
This is where things get really interesting, because the Chachnama has historically been used by both sides of the debate. Some scholars point to it as evidence for conversion under pressure, others against.
So what does Asif find when he looks closely?
He finds that the text itself, it seems largely unconcerned with narrating mass conversion.
Unconcerned, really. That's quite a statement.
It is. He argues the text's main focus isn't on making new Muslims. It's overwhelmingly focused on how to govern the existing non-Muslim populations, how to make them subjects of the new state.
So it's about political incorporation, not religious transformation.
That seems to be the thrust. Think about it. Is there actually any story of mass conversion in the Chachnama?
I don't recall one from the outline. Is there a conversion story?
There's exactly one direct
I
narrative,
think-
a single slave from Debol. He converts at the hands of Qasim.
Okay, one person. And how is that presented? Is it about faith?
Not really. The framing is all about political subjecthood. The slave, now called Mullah Islam, owned by Islam, essentially refuses to give the traditional slave greeting to the defeated Hindu king Dahar.
Why not?
He cites the law of the land and his new relationship to the king of Islam. It's presented entirely as a shift in political allegiance and legal status.
A political translation, like you said before, from one power regime to another.
Exactly. Not about saving his soul or the inherent superiority of one faith. And Asif emphasizes what's missing. The text doesn't talk about converting anyone else, really.
And crucially, it mentions Hindu advisors being appointed to high office.
Yes, people like Kisa, who is Dahar's minister, he becomes chief treasurer under Qasim, and there's no mention of him needing to convert.
He's valued for his skills, his wisdom.
Right. His religion doesn't seem to be an issue or a source of anxiety for the political theory the text is laying out. It suggests competence and contribution to the state were more important than religious identity for these roles.
So the picture emerging is one where governance relies on finding ways to include diverse people, not forcing them to be the same. How does the text show this working day to day? How do you actually rule like that?
Well, again, the text uses precedents, often drawing parallels between how the earlier Brahmin ruler, Chak, dealt with different groups and how Qasim later does. It shows Chak using a kind of sliding scale of conquest.
Depending on the situation.
Yeah. At Sika, it's harsh. Kill the warriors, enslave the rest, put in a foreign governor. At Sistan, it's more negotiated. Surrender, treaty, pay taxes.
And then Brahmanabad.
Brahmanabad is the most accommodating under Chach. Amnesty, treaty, and importantly, no initial taxation on the general populace.
These examples show different strategies, but also that civilians could negotiate.
Definitely. The text emphasizes the capacity of groups like merchants or artisans to negotiate directly with the conqueror, and it stresses the ruler's duty to protect the population.
So how does Qasim apply these models?
He follows them closely, takes Brahmanabad again. When Qasim arrives, the Buddhist merchants approach him, seeking an alliance, just like they might have with Chach.
And Qasim agrees.
He grants them peace, guarantees their prosperity, tells them to stay in their country. He imposes only light taxes on merchants and artisans, specifically exempts farmers and builders. He even appoints local elites as administrators.
And respects their laws and customs.
Yes. The text quotes him saying something to the effect of, whoever stays on his own law require tax. There's an allowance for customary practices like singing and dancing. It's a clear model of incorporating non-Muslims peacefully with significant legal and economic accommodation.
And that story about the people of Error appealing to Qasim based on expecting just and righteous conduct, that implies a shared understanding of good governance, regardless of the ruler's religion.
It really highlights this dialogic relationship. Subjects aren't just passive. They have expectations. They appeal to justice. They hold the ruler accountable to the terms of the political contract.
So the theory is, recognize difference, translate it into political structures, like different tax statuses or administrative roles, govern justly, and you get coexistence.
That's the core idea. Non-Muslims brought under Muslim rule, accommodated within Islamic law, treated based on context through law and taxation. Essentially, economic groups are embraced, their customs supported, and in return, they offer loyalty.
But you said earlier this accommodation had limits. It wasn't universal.
Absolutely not. The Chachnama definitely reflects the social biases of its time. And the prime example of the limits of its accommodation is the treatment of the Jats.
The nomadic group, how are they portrayed?
They're consistently presented as a problem, a threat to settled urban order. They resist centralized authority, whether it's Hindu or Muslim. They're seen as destabilizing, even after forts fall.
And the solution proposed by the text isn't accommodation or conversion.
Definitely not conversion. Never even suggested. The solution is purely legal and political discipline. Harsh laws designed to control and marginalize them.
These are the laws first set by Chuck. The ones about clothing, not riding horses with saddles, being accompanied by dogs.
Those exact ones. Humiliating, restrictive laws aimed at policing them, settling them, stripping them of status markers. Prohibiting swords, silk clothes, demanding they go barefoot and bareheaded outside, forcing them to supply wood, using them as guides and spies.
And when Qasim comes along and the Jats are still seen as troublesome,
he asks his local advisors, ministers who had served the previous regime, about the existing laws. They recount Chach's laws, describe the Jats as inherently rebellious, thievish, barbaric.
And Qasim.
He simply reaffirms Chach's laws. The text layers these precedents, Chach's laws, sanctioned by Qasim, and even referencing how early caliphs like Umar dealt with similar groups elsewhere. It's all about legal continuity and control.
So, for this group perceived as fundamentally outside or against the political order, the answer is legal circumscription, not religious change.
Precisely. The contrast between how merchants and artisans are accommodated and how the Jats are disciplined really sketches the boundaries of the Chachnama's political theory. It's driven by concerns of governance, stability, and legal status, not theology or universal brotherhood.
That's a really clear illustration of the theory's contours. Let's shift gears slightly. How does this textual theory connect to the actual physical landscape? You mentioned the well of Baba Farid.
Right, the well in Ouch. It's fascinating because local memory links it to both Qasim in the 8th century, supposedly he dug it, and the great Sufi saint Baba Farid, who meditated there in the 13th century, around when the Chachnama was likely composed.
So the site itself kind of holds these different layers of history together, military rival and spiritual presence.
Exactly. It embodies how the past gets remembered and layered in a place. And there's that famous story associated with Baba Farid at this well.
The one with the Hindu merchant.
Yes. Rai Bagmai sees Baba Farid deep in ascetic meditation, brings him food out of respect. When Farid finishes, he blesses the merchant and accepts him as a disciple,
Without asking him to convert.
without asking him to convert. It's a powerful local narrative explaining continued Hindu veneration for the Sufi saint, and it perfectly mirrors the Chachnama's ethos of recognizing virtue and connection across religious lines without demanding uniformity.
It's like the theory lived on in local memory and practice. What about other Sufi stories from that era? Do they show similar dynamics?
Often, yes, if you read them carefully. Take stories about Sufis encountering yogis, for example. Sometimes the texts use the very same word, like sahar, to describe the supernatural powers of both the Sufi and the yogi.
Suggesting their powers are different in scale, maybe, but not fundamentally different in kind. A shared understanding of sacral power.
Exactly. It points towards a kind of translation between sacral regimes, not just one dominating the other.
Yeah.
Or a Sufi might take over a yogi's house, but the justification isn't just conquest, it's that both are fakirs, ascetics, or perhaps that the yogi was unjust, making the transition a political or moral correction.
And these stories are often very grounded. Trees, rivers, houses.
Yes, rooted in the material world, the landscape. This dual habitation you see Qasim's, while becoming Baba Farid's, a yogi's house becoming a Sufi's, reflects this politics of cohabitation, this framework for recognizing different traditions sharing the same space, which aligns beautifully with the political theory we see in the Chachnama.
So if we bring all these threads together, the Chachnama read through Asif's lens really emerges not as a simple chronicle of invasion, not as a justification for forced conversion.
No, it emerges as a robust piece of political thinking,
Hmm.
a text deeply invested in figuring out how to govern a diverse society through practical means, alliance, law, justice, managing difference through political and legal status.
Based on recognition and accommodation, using earlier precedents, even Hindu-Buddhist ones, as models for Muslim rule.
Right. Key takeaways are that recognition of different forms of sacral power, the political incorporation of diverse communities like merchants, building alliances with non-Muslim elites like Hindu advisors, and using law to discipline disruptive groups like the Jats all operate without demanding religious conformity.
And it treats subjects as active participants, right? People with legal standing, moral expectations, engaging in dialogue with rulers, drawing on shared legal and historical ideas.
It absolutely does, which is why this reading offers such a powerful challenge to the standard narrative. It suggests the early Muslim presence wasn't just about conquest and conversion, but involved complex negotiation, legal frameworks, and the creation of a space where difference could and did coexist.
What a fascinating deep dive. We started by asking, what if Islam's arrival was marked by coexistence, not just conquest? And looking at the Chachnama this way reveals this incredible text focused on precisely that, building a political world through negotiation, law, and accommodation of difference.
It's a world away from the idea of an immediate, inevitable clash.
It really is, and it makes you think, doesn't it? For you, the listener, how does reevaluating a historical narrative like this one potentially change how we think about identity and coexistence in our own diverse world today?
Yeah, and what other historical moments or maybe other texts that we think we know might actually reveal something quite different if we looked at them through a new lens, challenging the dominant story?
Definitely gives you a lot to chew on.